So, first I want to just remind you of the type of organization that More discusses in Utopia, what kind of political organization that it has. And it's somewhat Platonic, but not entirely, because Plato's best regime is one that's ruled by the wise, right? In Plato's Republic, it's actually ruled by philosophers. And even in the Gorgias, the book that you read, the implication is that a rhetorician, a democratic rhetorician, is way down on Plato's list of leaders. He would prefer to have somebody who understands justice, as he says, and deals with people justly and thinks of the common good. Well, Thomas More's Utopia does have a prince for life. And this prince, though, is not necessarily somebody who imposes himself on people or is there simply because he is wise, although the implication is that he is wise because he's selected in a process, a rather complicated process of selection as a part of the hierarchy that rules this nation. So there's that part, that there's a prince that once selected rules for life. And that's somewhat like Plato's ideas, but not entirely. Because this prince is not a philosopher, he is just simply selected as the best of the best, though. Okay? We have elements of democracy. Remember that the various cities send senators to an assembly, and from time to time that assembly meets and it votes on issues. And so there is that, and that means that the families, anyway, are represented. The Senate is a part of the decision-making process. And it's not one person, one vote, as we would think of democracy here, but rather the families are represented. Okay, so that's a little different. There are checks on abuse of power. If that prince becomes tyrannical, he can be removed. Okay? And again, that indicates that the prince is not necessarily the wisest of wise. There's a possibility that the wrong man will be selected, or once put in that place and given that kind of security, he may not perform well. So there is the ability to remove him. Okay? Also, when it comes to the Senate and other deliberative bodies, there's a check on them in that they can't decide on the same day as an issue is debated. So there's a rule that says that when they get together and they're discussing an issue, they can't decide immediately. And that reflects somewhat the Platonic idea that the democratic assembly is very volatile. Okay? More understands that if you put people together and ask them to decide on something, their decision, at least initially, might not be very wise. Now, More, doesn't go Plato's way and decide that an assembly is really no good, or an assembly is, not a good thing to have, but he at least puts in a rule that says that they cannot immediately decide. They have to go home, they have to think about it. There has to be some time interval there, which hopefully will cool people and make them think more objectively. Okay? So I guess all in all, I would say that More has a little more faith in the people's ability to make decisions than Plato does, because he has this assembly, because he has them actually making decisions. And probably part of the reason for that is that his city is set up so that every person is included in the ideals, not just the upper class who live in communism, but in More's city, everybody lives in communism. Everybody is taught the correct values. Everybody is really fairly equal. And so he would expect them to be able to participate fairly responsibly. But Plato never did think that you could spread the ideals out evenly to everybody. You could never expect everybody to live a life of wisdom or learning or moderation. You could only expect them to be ruled by wise and moderate people, and hopefully that would trickle down, so to speak, a little bit to the people, but not to the extent that More expects it to. More's city is really more of an ideal in a way than Plato's. More expects that people can do better, and he's urging a system in which everybody is encouraged to live well. And so I want to go through several elements in in More's utopia that are very Platonic and that extend the Platonic ideal down to the people. Okay? One of those elements is anti-materialism. Okay? We talked about that quite a bit last time we met. Plato was anti-materialistic too. He thought that the more that people paid attention to the things around them, like money and sex and relationships, even power, the more that people paid attention to the worldly things, the less happy they would really be, the more ruled by their desires they would be. Well, More totally agrees, because you see so many ways in which utopia tries to control materialism. We talked about his rather humorous proposal to make chamber pots out of gold last time we met. That's just it's a very stark way of saying he wants people to realize the true value of things. Gold is just a metal to him, it's just a substance, and people go far astray when they attribute this great, quality to it and esteem it above human relationships and above the relationship with God, etc. So you see in utopia that everything is geared to not wasting any item. Okay? They have plain clothes, and they all wear approximately the same thing. They all have rather plain and sturdy and useful houses, and they keep everything up. They don't, throw things out. They fix them. And all of that is designed to keep people from thinking so much about stuff, about material things. Okay? So Plato very much agrees with this, and I think that we can see there a lot of influence of Platonic philosophy on More, who is surely familiar with it. So there's that. And then there's this emphasis on learning as the chief pleasure. I think I said to you last week that More has a pretty unusual, for us, definition of reason or the rational life. Okay? Many of us do not necessarily leap to the conclusion that the scholarly way of life is the best life or the most rational life, or it would be good to have a whole community of scholars. Okay? But Plato and More both see it that way. Okay? Plato believed that the contemplative life, the life of learning, the life of seeking justice in philosophy was the best life. Now, he didn't think that everybody could pursue it. Okay? And More seems to think that most people should be very much encouraged to pursue it, so there's a difference there. But they're very similar in what they consider to be best. Leisure is desirable for both because it can be used for learning. If you have extra time, and you hopefully do have extra time, then you will use it to enrich your mind. And in the process of enriching your mind, you will come to realize more and more what justice is. You will be a better person. Okay? There's a quote from Utopia, which you can find on page 53, which I put up here, that just reminds me so much of Plato. He has to have been a student of Plato. He has to have read The Republic and other Platonic dialogues, because he says this in so much the same way that Plato said. Even in the Gorgias, the book that you read, you remember Socrates makes the point that really the life of the pursuit of desires is painful. People think of it as pleasurable, but they're constantly in pain. If they weren't in pain, they wouldn't have the desires to do all the things that they want to do. More says on page 53, if any man imagines that there is a real happiness in these physical enjoyments, then he must confess that he would be the happiest of all men if he were to lead his life in perpetual hunger, thirst, and itching, and by consequence in perpetual eating, drinking, and scratching himself, which anyone may easily see would not only be a base but a miserable state of life. These are indeed the lowest of pleasures and the least pure, for we can never relish them but when they are mixed with contrary pains. And that is a term straight out of Plato and also out of Aristotle, his student, that idea of mixed pleasures. And both of them said that mixed pleasures, those pleasures that are mixed with pain, are inferior to the unmixed pleasures. And the most unmixed pleasure of all, of course, is the life of learning. There's no pain that comes with it, supposedly. It's entirely a pleasure, which is kind of an interesting argument. But, you know, he makes this out to be a life of almost like a pig, an animal, right? And in Plato's Republic, the first proposal for the city actually is called the city of pigs, because it's a city in which people just sort of enjoy the simple life, eating and drinking and sleeping and so forth. And they reject that city and then move on to build their city in speech with its ideal hierarchy and so forth. So there's a great similarity there. And it's something that strikes us in the modern world as kind of odd to place so much emphasis on learning, because we tend to think of learning in a sort of utilitarian sense of we learn in order to do. You know, like we're here at the university to learn in order so that we can get a job or so that we can have a skill, right, that leads to a job. And the idea that learning is a sort of good in itself, and even the idea that it's the highest good, okay, is something that's kind of foreign to our sensibilities now. So it's an interesting perspective, and one that's a little hard to grasp, but it certainly is something that was believed not only at this time, but for a long, long time, up until the 20th century, even in European, you know, the European or Western system. The idea of learning as the ideal life was much more accepted than it is now, where we tend to see it as a means to an end. Okay? All right. So there's that similarity between More and Plato. And there's also the regulation of the family. That's a theme in More's Utopia. And that makes us uncomfortable. You know, many of the proposals he makes, I would be very surprised if you liked them, you know. The idea that the family should be made up of 40 or so people and organized around a task, and that there should be a definite head of the family, and it's the oldest and wisest man. And the family, you know, is constructed around its usefulness to the community and not necessarily the blood or hereditary relations. Okay? All of that strikes us as odd, and then it becomes more uncomfortable when More says, and when they have an excess of children, they send them off to a family that doesn't have as many children, or if they have too few, they bring in some from another. Okay? And also he talks about rotating, remember, rotating people out of country homes and making them work in the city and vice versa. The emphasis actually being on getting city people to go to the country. Okay? So